Story 1. I'm an officer in the Philippine Army. The night before the first time, it's hard to sleep. I'm rehearsing scenarios in my head, contingency after contingency, ensuring the non-commissioned officers in my platoon know what's up, ensuring the gear is right. So it was very busy. When I got to bed, I was thinking of my then-girlfriend, telling myself I'd see her again. I wrote up a long message saying how much I love her, but didn't send it for fear of being melodramatic. It was a mixture of excitement and fear, like an athlete training for game day and finally being so close. Actual firefights are hectic. Firefights I've been in have all been in jungles, except for one in a built-up area, so it is at short ranges. Very loud and disorienting, especially if it's your first time. Lots of guys freeze their first time. Luckily, I did not. Shots broke out. I commanded the lead squad to skirmish and return fire, and commanded the rear squad to maneuver to higher ground. I remember hearing nothing but explosions, gunshots, and shouting. I remember hearing the enemy leader's commands and their trash talking. I remember a new private blind firing and his squad leader telling him to quit it. I remember my machine gunner cleaning his weapon mid-firefight because it jammed, and me switching my rifle to full auto so the enemy would think we were laying down machine gun fire. I remember seeing my wounded soldier after the engagement, and I thought he was dead. I almost cried right there and then, but I forced myself to do my job first, that is, apply aid and call for medical evacuation. I don't feel fear during a firefight, but always after. Like thinking, I could have died during this moment or that moment. And my knees always started shaking after a fight. But when it is still ongoing, I am ashamed to admit I sort of enjoy it like playing your favorite sport. This will probably get buried, but I thought to give an insight from an officer's perspective. Story 2. Lying on a cot next to my vehicle in the desert in 2003, we were told we would be crossing into Iraq at 4 a.m. Everything had been checked, rechecked, and checked again. I made sure all 18 of my guys were loaded up and bedded down and security was up. I had been awake for 20 to 22 hours by this point and finally lay down at about 1 a.m. Sleep didn't come. I remember listening to Don't Know Why by Norah Jones on my MP3 player over and over. I teared up a little, thinking about my kids. When I finally closed my eyes, it was time to get up and go. And I didn't sleep for 2 more days. Story 3. Slept like a baby. Interestingly, the day before I got blown up, I was absolutely 100% certain I was going to die or lose my left leg. Not a leg. Not a limb. My left leg. I emailed my wife. It was not that I was scared. I just knew it somehow. Never felt a feeling of dread or fear or anything before that night. Had the bomb functioned correctly, I would be dead, but it did not, and I lost my left leg. Story 4. Mostly full of tasks and things to do for preparation. There is always something to do to go with a greater sense of security, and it was also pretty good to occupy myself so that I will not have time for disturbing thoughts. Story 5. Usually preparations and briefings. The first time is always the weirdest. You will most likely be overcome with fear and adrenaline at the same time. To me, it felt like I was being microwaved. The most intense gunfight our unit faced was unplanned and unexpected. Those are the ones that leave the most scars emotionally. Story 6. I had a dream where I met my ex-girlfriend's dad who had died 2 years prior at a coffee shop in heaven. His death really impacted me. He was kind and assuring that I would be okay and that I would come home. It was surreal. I woke up crying and then boarded a plane later that day for Iraq. Story 7. I have 2 tours in Iraq. For the first one, I was 19. I didn't know what to expect, and I was excited. I had been training for this moment for a long time and was ready to fulfill my purpose. There was very little fear or anxiety, which quickly changed once in the country. My second tour came a year after the end of my first, and my emotions were totally different. I knew what to expect this time and was scared and angry. I was a leader by this point and knew that my responsibility going in was much greater. I always say that the worst day of my life was the first day of my second deployment, knowing that I was at the very start of a year in hell since I'd already been there, and there was no getting out of it. Story 8. Tour in Iraq and Afghanistan. I was in a support role, so no frontline fighting for me. For Iraq, we started in Kuwait. I was called up at all hours of the night to assist the teams rolling out to Baghdad. For example, we had the first version of Blue Force trackers. When we got to Kuwait, we had to reprogram them all to use a different satellite. We had one Blue Force tracker civilian, and he needed help, so many nights from 12 to 2 a.m. were spent getting them programmed to roll out on time. There was more eagerness to get out of Kuwait and get the mission started. Tired of mostly sitting around with not much to do. Once it was my time, it was nervousness about the unknown. I don't think I had much fear due to an arrogance or sense of invincibility, but I emotionally disconnected from the real world and family. I don't think those connections really came back either. We lost around 20 to 30 folks, including one of my college buddies. Worked 6 to 12-hour shifts and was on call, so I got woken up at 3 or 4 a.m. many times to resolve things. Afghanistan was scarier. I was being brought into one of the most dangerous parts of Afghanistan at the time, with a lot of improvised explosive devices and Taliban presence. I was scared to go. Once I got to my camp, though, it became everyday life and a routine. Rockets at night always missing. A few close calls. A few direct hits on the Afghan army base with casualties. That was connected to ours. Had a good team, which made the time run pretty smoothly. Worked 5 8-hour days and would do a half day on Saturday just in case I had to finish something. Got to the gym daily, which was good for mental health. Became stir-crazy and begged to drive for our weekly supply runs to a larger forward operating base. I was allowed to go until the second person was killed by an improvised explosive device. I was only allowed to fly anywhere I went from then on. Overall, less stress than Iraq, too. We lost 2 close individuals, and that haunts me to this day. Best sleep I ever had was in the country, though. No insomnia. Good, deep sleep, even through rocket attacks. Story 9. I was in Kuwait in 2003, waiting to enter the country. I was on the border in a tent city. I remember feeling relieved. We had been stuck in Kuwait for 6 weeks, sweating profusely, showering once every 3 days, bored out of our minds, eating poor-quality meals full of sand from the twice-weekly sandstorms. I was anxious, like everyone here describes, and did not sleep much the night before. However, if I was going to die, I just wanted to get going. I was so tired of sitting in the desert doing nothing, and we had 3 or 4 false starts. It was like everything else in the army for me: firing range, demolition range, ropes course, rappelling, etc. By the time it actually happened, I just wanted it over with. Story 10. Went in 2014. Had a lady friend come over under the impression of helping me pack. So naturally, I didn't pack up until an hour before I was supposed to clear the barracks. Sitting around waiting for the buses to the airport, I napped and got in trouble for having hickeys. The feeling of, oh no, didn't kick in until I got a hug from the hug lady, probably the only good thing Hood had going for it, and then walked onto the tarmac. Ended up in Romania for about a week, then flew into Afghanistan. Once those doors opened and you felt that unbearable heat and stench, that's when it really hit. I got into a focused, game-time thought process. The first firefight changed that mindset into realizing, oh no, this is really real. And then it was more the adrenaline guiding my consciousness. Towards the halfway point, there was more conscious thought than adrenaline. And finally, towards the end, it was the missions where we weren't getting shot at that bothered me. You start thinking, what are they doing? Why aren't they firing? What are they planning? Stuff like that. It was my first and only combat deployment so far. I was just a private, so other people's thoughts are probably different. Story 11. I spent a few nights before going to war zones. As a general rule, those nights were very quiet. People lost in their own thoughts, writing to loved ones. A few making peace with their deities. Some were trying to get their possibly last good night's sleep, others not being able to. Every now and then those awake would get up and wander around a bit. Obviously we would check, double-check, triple-check, and so on gear and equipment. But honestly, you can only strip and lubricate a gun so many times before it's just repetitive. There's usually a low-stakes spades game going on somewhere, but again, it's usually pretty quiet and low-key. I want to point out and stress I was a mechanic going to war with my mechanic unit supporting the infantry and tankers. And the above has been my experience for my units and for my wars. Others, I'm sure, had different experiences. Story 12. For me, I was far more nervous leaving for Afghanistan than I was before stepping off to occupy our forward operating bases and actually get into the fight. I went to Afghanistan in 2008 with the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines. Earlier in the year, the worst bombing of the war at that point left 100 people dead, and we were on a short turnaround from a deployment my seniors had done in Iraq. Tension was pretty high, and we were prepping for a really rough time, and the lead up to that left me really nervous, even if I did everything I could to hide it. When we left Kandahar for what was then known as Camp Bastion, it would later become Camp Leatherneck, I felt pretty safe in my turret. My squad started operating in Gereshk, and most of those nerves went down. Gereshk wasn't particularly hot, and the early weeks of that left me more bored and hot than anything. During my squad's first dismounted patrol, I was left behind with a couple of others to watch our vehicles, and my squad got into a firefight. Honestly, I remember being jealous more than afraid. Felt like I missed out. In June, I was on quick reaction force when one of our other squads was hit by a suicide bomber in a busy bazaar. In the confusion and hustle, someone took my turret, and I ended up as a dismount in the lead vehicle. I ended up helping move our 2 killed in action, the squad leader and an interpreter who slept 1 bunk over from me. I remember that shook me up really bad. I swore I'd refuse to go out into that bazaar if they tried to send us there again, and one of my seniors who I considered a friend just shrugged and said, "Someone's got to go. I'd go in your place." That broke something in me because looking at him, I was just like, damn man, I can't let you go in my place. If you're going, so will I. He had been right there with me loading one of his friends who had been killed into my poncho that day, and if he could still get up and get out there, so could I. He took his own life some years later, unfortunately. Anyway, a couple of days later, we left on a mounted patrol near the same area we'd just lost guys in, and I was back in my turret. At one point, we were stopped. I was sitting really low in my turret when I saw someone on the roof of a building maybe 50 meters away, peeking over, then hiding and peeking again. Something snapped that moment because as I called it out and oriented my turret toward that roof, I just remember thinking to myself, fear doesn't serve you here, and letting go. It literally felt like a wave of calm washing over me. Nothing happened, we continued driving on. My squad would later get sent to Sanjin, which was the Wild West, and things would get way harder from there, but I stopped being scared that day. Even in the heat of a serious firefight with rockets and rounds impacting within feet of my position, I just did not feel the same kind of fear I felt before that moment in my turret. Story 13. 2 tours in Afghanistan. I think I slept okay leading up to heading over. I guess I just didn't really know what I was in for. The long, strange nights came once I was already there and couldn't get the images of brains and blown-up children out of my head. That, along with constant middle-of-the-night rocket bombardments, made for plenty of sleepless and restless nights. Story 14. Numb and disassociated. Every single day. For a year. And it was very pronounced if we ever visited a large base for a hot meal or a new pair of socks. Everyone there would be having fun, while we were trying to figure out how long our makeshift armor would last and wondering if the mail ever came in. I was never able to reset to normal, even after returning to the United States. Story 15. I was a combat engineer in the Marines in Afghanistan. My job was to clear a path for the infantry, using a metal detector and my eyes to spot improvised explosive devices buried in the ground, basically making sure I found them, avoided them, or got blown up before anyone else. Prior to this operation, my job was to just get from point A to point B without dying. That was fine with me because I could take unusual routes through places where I thought they wouldn't plant improvised explosive devices, such as irrigation creeks and agricultural or poppy fields, to minimize the likelihood of getting blown up. For this particular operation, my job was to clear a landing zone for the medical evacuation helicopter we were likely going to use right outside the village, sweep clear areas for other Marines to post security around the village, then go into the village and seek out and dispose of all the improvised explosive devices we could find, so the local populace could use that side of the village without fear of getting blown up themselves. I didn't sleep the night before. All I could think of was how bad stubbing my toe felt, then multiplying that by 1,000 for the impending amputation I was about to endure. I wiggled my toes all night thinking, well, this is my last night with legs. Anxiety was killing me. I ended up not getting my legs blown off, so that was fortunate. I found 4 devices but missed one. An army guy embedded in our patrol stepped off my path and got his legs blown off a couple of guys back from me. The commanding officer called it a day after that, and we got into a small firefight on the way back to our patrol base. Story 16. Former artillery officer. Did 2 combat tours in 2014 to 2015 and 2017. I left on my first deployment with a child on the way, so I thought about my wife and how I would miss the end of her pregnancy. She probably thinks I'm a badass and how good the loving will be when I get home. I thought about how my son would hear stories of me being a hero and a huge false sense of grandeur if anything bad were to happen to me. I felt invincible and had no fear of death or leaving anyone behind. My second deployment came after my son was here, and I had a chance to be a father. I absolutely did not want to leave him or my wife behind now. I felt sad thinking that he could grow up without a father and my wife without me. They were staying at her sister's in California, so we could save money while I was gone. The most affordable flight to California was 2 days before I left, so I dropped them off at the airport and cried in the car by myself. I stayed the final night eating pizza and playing video games with my brother, who I was deploying with. We talked about what this deployment would be like and what we knew of the mission. He then went on a date, and I played World of Warcraft until my wife called to say they had landed in California.